So thank you, Andy. Lots of beautiful pictures of beating hearts. While we're switching over the computers here, I want to introduce our next speaker, who's a longtime friend and colleague. Dr. Kathryn Taubert is a senior scientist at the American Heart Association in Dallas, Texas. She's also a professor of physiology at the University of Texas. And Kathryn is a friend to the world of Kawasaki disease. She's been a real advocate at the American Heart Association for this disease and for funding research for the disease. And I think she's going to give you some valuable insights into how the whole research mechanism works. So, Kathryn, thanks for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you all very much, and special hello to Dr. Kawasaki, Mrs. Kawasaki. It's so nice to see you again. And I am delighted to be here today. I have worked with Kawasaki disease myself in some studies on the epidemiology of Kawasaki disease within the United States. And what I want to talk about mainly today, briefly what American Heart does in the area of Kawasaki disease, and then more specifically getting into research. But what we do overall in Kawasaki disease is we have the AHA Kawasaki Disease Committee. And part of that committee is the Kawasaki Disease Writing Group. You've heard the guidelines that were mentioned in a talk before the break where the risk stratification was done. And several of us in the room were on those guidelines. And there was reference to them later today, this morning, in regard to the studies that are being done in adults. And will we modify the guidelines or expand them perhaps for guidelines specifically for the adult patients with Kawasaki disease? And that's something that we've talked about at the committee, and I'm sure we'll talk about again at our next meeting. We also have co-sponsored since the 1980s every one of the Kawasaki disease international conferences, and you'll see here Dr. Kawasaki, that was made in Taipei last year when we had the meeting there, but this meeting is about once every 3 years, different places around the world. It had always been on U.S. soil or Japanese soil until the last meeting when it was in Taipei. And we're looking at moving it around in recognition of the fact that this is a global disease. Additionally, funds research. We lobby Congress for research dollars, not for us. We do not take government money, but we lobby Congress to give more funding to the National Institutes of Health and to the CDC. So that's something that's pretty important that we do in trying to keep that at the forefront of the government money, because they are the biggest funders of research in the United States. We do news releases for original papers published in AHA journals, some of which have been on Kawasaki disease. So a study is published by a researcher, and our news department will choose to highlight it, and that sees that it gets into newspapers. It may make spots on TV and so forth. And I think that's very helpful in the whole awareness issue. And then we have a big scientific meeting, which is coming up in a week. This year in Orlando, Florida, the annual scientific sessions. There are always papers presented, people's research. And this, again, people from all over the world come to that and get to hear other researchers doing things in Kawasaki disease. And it brings those people together. They're often from different countries. They can come together and talk about what they're doing, how they may mutually help one another. Research facts, and this is something important to emphasize, and that the AHA does not do targeted research. We don't predetermine the specific areas of research. We don't say that this year there'll be $5 million for stroke research and $5 million for adult coronary artery disease and $5 million for congenital heart disease, or X amount for studying obesity in children and adults. But rather, the research grants are investigator-initiated. People submit grants on any area of research that they may be doing in the broad field of cardiovascular diseases, and then the best of those grants are funded. But that doesn't mean that all the best are going to be in adult heart disease. You'll see in a minute they go into different buckets, and a certain percentage of each of those buckets get funded. And overall, about 20% of all of the applications that are submitted are funded. That may sound low, but let me say, and it is, but let me say first of all that not every grant that's submitted should be funded. Sometimes they're not well written, it's not a good idea, it's an idea that there's already an answer for, and sometimes they're, well, all of the grants that are reviewed get comments from peer reviewers, so those comments can go back and make an application stronger and the person can resubmit. I think all of us in this room who are physicians and scientists who have done research have had a grant rejected at some point. I certainly have, and I'm sure most other people have too. And when it's your grant that's rejected, you think, well, there's something wrong with that review committee. They're crazy because my grant's wonderful. But you start looking at the comments that they give back and you say, gee, you know, they're right. I should have had this other group to look at, or this other task. So you incorporate that, you resubmit it, and then often you're successful at that point. Much of the money from the American Heart Association is directed toward early career investigators, and the more seasoned researchers often go on to the National Institutes of Health for further research support. We like to be able to fund the people in the earlier stages of their career. That gets them ready to do these bigger, broader studies that they can then go to the NIH to get funding for. We do have some grants. Not all grants have to go to young investigators, but a lot of our programs are specifically, that's what we feel that we're almost in partnership with NIH in that regard, is that we help these people get the research experience and the early research grants that they need to go on and get NIH money. And those are the types of grants we have, just everything from pre-doctoral fellowship students who are still in their training to people coming out and just getting their postdoctoral training in fellowship, moving then into faculty, developing scientists, grants in age. Established Investigator Award doesn't mean it's for the more senior people, it's to get people toward that more senior area, and then the regular grants. When I'm talking about awards today, I'm going to call everything grants, whether they're grants or fellowships. So when grants come in, they're assigned to a study section for peer review, and there are about 23 of these study sections currently. I'll tell you what they are. And the person submitting the grant, the investigator, they choose the study section that they want their application to go to. So there is assurance that if you're studying Kawasaki disease, your grant wouldn't wind up in a stroke section. You go in and you pick based upon keywords that your grant represents and keywords that a study section studies, so you can get your grant to the right place. Now, a study section has to receive a certain number, so that's why you wouldn't have a small study section. There have to be at least 36 grants. And if there's more than 100 applications, then the study section splits into two so that no one group is overburdened. Each of these study sections have 12 to 15 researchers who are peers in the area that that grant is about that make up each of these study sections. Now, this very busy cartoon shows that there are actually a lot of steps, and I don't want to go through everything, but first of all, you've got to get the idea, you've got to submit it, it's got to go to those reviewers, they review it, they make a list is made of from the best to the worst, basically. Research committee says how much funding there's going to be and how far down on the list you can go, and then the person finds out. And then as the research is done, it's being published, and then you've got the findings that are translated perhaps from a basic research study. What do these findings mean at the bedside? So at the bottom of the slide, off of the screen, but it says findings translated from bench to bedside. So right here, the assigned to reviewers, that's what I'm going to talk about next as it regards the different study section. So I'm showing you all of the study sections, and the ones that are highlighted are the ones that you could see Kawasaki disease grants in. Basic cell and molecular biology. You could see some here, bioengineering and biotechnology. Part of what we just heard in the last talk was some of that biotechnology, and that group's even looking at things that we still read about in fictional novels of nanotechnology, but we know that that's an area that's going to move forward in many disease states, and it could be true for some of that research in Kawasaki. Epidemiology, prevention, outcomes, behavioral science, epidemiology grants and grants looking at prevention might wind up being sent to that study section. There's one brain, cardiac biology, cardiac renal, cardiovascular development. This is where at least half of the Kawasaki grants go to, because this is where pediatric cardiovascular disease is. Most of the reviewers in this particular study section are pediatric cardiologists. Here's some others: cell transport and function, electrophysiology and arrhythmias, immunology and virology. This is probably where roughly the other half of the studies go, where the infectious diseases of the cardiovascular system are studied. Integrative cardiac biology, coronary artery studies are there, and some of the studies looking at how aneurysms can develop might be there. Lipids and lipoprotein analysis is another. And skipping down, microbiology and microbial pathogenesis, that's where others could go. That used to be the same study section with the immunology, but it got big enough that they split immunology and microbiology. Going down, radiology and imaging. Certainly grants on looking at better imaging techniques or better understanding what the role is of the monitoring of the coronary artery calcium could go there. Surgery, surgical techniques that might be especially relevant to very small, to babies' small hearts. That's a study that might go there. Everything about thrombosis and blood clotting, there could be studies here that are relevant or about KD. And then skipping down again, finally, vascular wall biology. We've talked about the fact that it is a blood vessel disease and something's going on at that vascular wall. So a Kawasaki disease grant that's particularly interested in that might go, they might decide that they feel it should go to that particular study section. And a list of all of the grants that are funded by American Heart are on the website. And by the way, we now have two website names. The other one's a little bit easier. It's just Heart, www.heart.org or www.americanheart.org. You can put a slash in research, and you can actually find every grant that's getting AHA dollars. Currently, there are 3 research grants that are directly related to KD that are being funded by AHA. And when I say directly related, that means they actually have the name Kawasaki disease in their title somewhere. And I have to just tell you one thing. A few years ago when I was doing a study and I asked our research department, they print out the things for me, and I go through and analyze which ones fit into the categories for any talk I'm going to give. And I said, I want all the ones that are on Kawasaki disease, and I got the list back. And I knew that Dr. Jane Burns had AHA money, but she wasn't on the list. So according to the printout by AHA, her study didn't have anything to do with Kawasaki disease, and I think it's just because it wasn't in the title and somehow didn't get checked off in one of the keywords, although of course it was related. So I go through, and I've spent several hours going through about 188 pages of printouts, but the ones that are directly related, and then there are several others that are indirectly related. They are doing work, for instance, on aneurysms, and they have checked that their grant could be relevant to Kawasaki disease, although it's more basic, and they're looking at perhaps the basic pathology of why an aneurysm could form in a certain blood vessel and not in a certain other blood vessel. And then there are others whose relevance we simply don't recognize yet, because so much of the research done is very basic, and maybe it's on how cells talk to each other, and you find out that that becomes important in a certain disease state that you had never ever thought about, or studies that are going more into management of adults with coronary artery disease that now we're seeing could be very relevant as well to our children as they grow up. Now, for the spring of 2009 review cycle, just to give you a specific example of the grants that come in, because it's not just the numerator, but it's the denominator. So there were 5 applications directly related to Kawasaki disease submitted to AHA. We review grants twice a year, the spring and the fall. The fall research review cycle is going on right now. 1 of the 5 received AHA funding. 1 of the 5 would have received AHA funding, but they received funding from another source and withdrew the grant from AHA. What that means is they received, probably from NIH, they received funding from somewhere else for more money than the AHA application was for. So obviously they chose to take the grant that was going to fund them for a larger amount, again, from one of the divisions of NIH. So that left 3 that were unfunded. Really, 2 of the 5 were approved, which is a better percentage than the overall 20% rate. Of those 3 that were unfunded, I know that at least one of them has revised the grant and resubmitted it, and it's being re-reviewed now. They've taken those reviewer comments to heart, as it were, and have revised it, and probably this go-round they will get funded. We don't know yet. The other 2 I simply don't know about. But that's how it's done. So if we, in Kawasaki disease, when I've gone back and looked, although the denominator is small, there aren't that many grants that are submitted, but the funding rate is usually somewhere around a 33–40%. So it's better than the overall funding rate. And that's for the ones, as I said, that are directly relevant. We need to encourage investigators to submit grants, those who are interested in Kawasaki disease, especially the young investigators. I will say that the one that received the funding in the Spring Network happens to be our speaker 2 speakers ago, Dr. Lori Daniels. So that money came right here to UCSD. And so that's the process by which we do the funding of grants. And again, if there were more money, perhaps 50% of the grants could be funded. Not all should, but those that don't make it once, make their grant application stronger and come back again. So that then is a brief overview of how we do the funding and what we do in Katy. So thank you very much.